Hello and welcome everybody to this interaction. Thank you very much for joining us this evening from wherever you are. Some of you might have visited the Chennai Photo Biennale, and we had interactions at the Goethe Institute, and there's an online version as well. For those of you who haven't, this would be a 1 hour online walkthrough by the creators of Chicken Run, Parvathi Nayar and Nayantara Nayar. We've had the pleasure of working with them on a larger project called Limits of Change, which looks at a hitherto forgotten or maybe buried away important aspect of Indo-Korean history, where the Custodian Force of India played an active peacekeeping role in 1953 after the Korean War. Little available here in India, quite a bit available in Korea. And the Limits of Change project hopes to excavate this forgotten, but as I said, vital aspect of Indo-Korean history. And in a sense, help to revision, I think, the close ties between our two countries. Chicken Run is a slice of this larger project. And when we were chatting with the team at Chennai Photo Biennale, we realized pretty quickly that it's most probably going to be an online version and maybe some hybrid interactions, but more or less presentation online. So what Parvathi and Nayantara have done is that they have strung together a wonderful tapestry, actually, of what is a fictive narrative. There is historical elements and there are archival photos and videos, but there's also a fresh take with some of which were recreated in Chennai and presented seamlessly with, so as a fictive narrative, it works really well to talk about one such person, one such family who relocated from Korea after the repatriation efforts, was a prisoner of war at the DMZ, and then came in to set up a chicken farm in Chennai, Madras then, and Chennai now. So the mysterious Mr. H and his story is what Parvathi and Nayantara are going to take us through. But as they do that, they would also bring to light historical elements, personal histories, and it is going to be something that we hope will whet your appetite for the larger project, which will take off. But I just want to formally thank the Chennai Photo Biennale. I think it's been a terrific effort in the middle of the pandemic to be able to pull off this hybrid version. They've had two galleries joining in very actively. They've had the Roja Muttaya Library as well, a couple of physical spaces in Chennai, but also a fabulous archive, as well as various editions which they've been posting periodically, talking to all of the artists, understanding artistic intent and process. And Parvathi and Nayantara were also part of that first edition, and some of the interactions, as I said, at the Goethe earlier on, last month, in fact, and into this month. There's also a screening room with their film being shown. And I would just like to congratulate the Chennai Photo Biennale for not giving up this year, doing this very different version. And we hope that with the pandemic moving away and normalcy returning, that in safe surrounds, we'll have the full version next time around. We'll have I think it's going to come back with greater force. So I'll leave it at that at the moment, and I'm going to hand it over to Parvathi and Nayantara to take you through the hour, tell you about the project, introduce Chicken Run bit by bit. Enjoy the evening, and we hope we will have questions at the end, which we will take soon after the presentation's over. Thank you very much. Parvathi, over to you. Nayantara and Parvathi.
Thank you so much, Prathi. And thank you to everyone who's shown up. It's so lovely to see you all. And yes, pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you for the kind introductions, Rati. Hello, I'm Parvathi, and it's such a pleasure to welcome all of you. And we are really excited to take you on, truthfully, our first tour through the website of our artwork. And let's be honest, this is our first online tour of an artwork as well. So I will hand it over to Nayantara to take you through the history of our piece first.
Yeah. So just to give everyone a little bit of context about when the project is based, what moment of history, essentially we are looking at sort of the 1950s, specifically between 1950 and 53, during the Korean War. To explain it, towards the end of the World War II, Japan has control of Korea. When the war ends, they give control of it, part of it, to America, while Russia comes in and takes the other half. And suddenly Korea becomes the staging war of the Cold War itself. Essentially, the country is supposed to be moving towards, independence, but a break happens, and there sort of emerge two factions, the North and the South, communist versus, well, not precisely democratic, but something along those lines, and war breaks out. And this war is truly awful. It's one of the most devastating wars, of the 20th century, and very often forgotten and not talked about. But it leads to massive death, destruction, people being displaced, and the people of Korea find themselves essentially sort of really fighting their neighbors, and they're not always able to quite understand why they're fighting and what they're fighting for. And we found this period of history extremely interesting because there is this Indian involvement. So towards the end of the war, an armistice is declared, and there is sort of talk of some kind of tentative peace being reached, and there's a decision made to exchange prisoners of war. And while that's happening, a realization sort of happens on both sides. They realize that there are prisoners who don't want to go back to their home countries, and this becomes this big question: what to do with these prisoners? The peace that they were sort of working towards, the armistice itself, is very tentative, and there's a lot of worry that this could be the problem that sets all the work that they've done towards kind of calming the region down, sort of set them back. And that's the point at which there's a suggestion made in sort of the United Nations by actually an Indian contingent that a sort of explanation setting is set up where these prisoners of war who don't want to return to their home countries can sort of be gathered, and their home countries can have one chance to convince them to come back. And India suggests that this happens, it's taken up, and the United Nations decides to go ahead with it. They create something called the Neutral Nations Repatriation Committee, which has 4 members: Czechoslovakia, Poland, Sweden, and Switzerland. And India is appointed as the neutral chairman. And at the same time, India offers up the Custodian Forces of India as the actual ground forces, sort of troops sent in to guard the prisoners and protect them, but also to sort of ensure that they don't escape and head back to whichever way they wanted to go. And that's kind of the setting of the entire piece. We're looking at the story of one such prisoner, and one such prisoner who was in the demilitarized zone with the Indians, waiting for these explanations, trying to decide what was going to happen. And this prisoner that we've created, Mr. H, that's whose story we're telling today. So, yeah.
We could go to the next screen. So this is the construct of Chicken Run, which, as Rathi said, is an offshoot of the larger Limits of Change project, on which we've been working since 2017. So this construct, which is the device of the research blog belonging to curator P from the People's History Museum of Chennai, will link back to the larger Limits of Change project. Both curator P and the People's History Museum of Chennai are fictional, but invented for a specific purpose, because we would like to think of history not primarily as the story of heroes and victors, but as a collection of accounts of ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times. So using very real research, curator P tries to piece together a probable life for Mr. H, and in doing so tells us that history itself is something that is unstable and changing rather than transcendental and constant. The globalized world relentlessly pushes us into the now and the present. And we sometimes don't deal enough with the idea that the past is never really the past. It is at the very least like background radiation from the Big Bang that scientists say they can still sense and study. So we believe that this engagement between India and Korea is worth re-examining to uncover stories of war and peace, and not least, to remember that the newly minted Indian Army's first foray into the world was as peacekeepers to protect and guard after a terrible war, which is sometimes called the Forgotten War. Over to you, Nayantara.
So when you sort of enter our digital exhibition and you sort of get past the introduction, the first thing that we wanted to share with you was, some of this wonderful archival material that we've collected. And we also wanted to tell you something about Mr. H. We spend so much time with this character, and we really do we have this entire life that we'd imagined for him, and we wanted it to begin there. And so this video that you're going to watch tells you just that story. Can we play the video, please?
Mr. H would never forget the war. His memories were too painfully clear. But he also tried to remember, in just as much detail, his life before the war, his family, his village, the birdsong. Mr. H's village was just north of the 38th parallel, though of course back then, the 38th parallel meant nothing to him. For many Koreans, the 38th parallel didn't exist until 1945, when the Americans and the Russians decided it was the exact latitude along which Korea would be divided. 1945 was also the year that Mr. H's father put him in charge of the whole harvest. He was 16. At the end of the harvest season, men from the Communist Party visited their village looking for new recruits. They promised decent salaries and a bright future. Some men from neighboring villages joined up, but none from Mr. H's. Their futures were as bright as they needed them to be. Later, the same men returned, but this time they made no promises. Every man over 16 and under 50 was conscripted. That was in 1950, the year North and South Korea went to war. Mr. H found the war both terrifying and bewildering. His days were filled with the sounds of gunfire, bombs, and the gasps of dying men. Inexplicably, he also heard the roar of Russian planes, the precise stomping of Chinese soldiers who marched alongside him, the babble of languages from enemy camps, English, French, Greek, Spanish, Thai. Why were all these people in Korea? What were they fighting for? Years later, in Madras, Mr. H met a weary war photographer who said that the Korean War was just another instance of the world's superpowers battling for victory in lands far away from their own. Mr. H remembered bombed out cities and endless lines of people with their possessions tied to their backs as they fled, and he wondered just who had won.
So we come to the index, and Curator's Piece blog is filled with photographs, videos, and her own musings, which have been arranged chronologically as chapters of a timeline that allow you to easily revisit areas that interest you. But however, as we progress, you will see that we intercut and disrupt these timelines in a way that often reveals patterns. That's something that we're familiar with, aren't we? That if we examine our own lives, we see the presence of repetitions and patterns. Curator P is fascinated by such patterns and sees them as visual clues. If you can unlock a pattern, it may reveal an underlying order, the shape of a character, the story of a particular moment in history. There are so many things that Curator P does not and cannot know about the enigma that is Mr. H. So she restitches his narrative using historical insights and imagination into a rich tapestry. Could we just go back to the previous slide? So we have now chapter 1, which is called Encounters with Barbed Wire, the first encounters with barbed wire. And barbed wire is a motive throughout the project. It was first developed in France in 1865, then came to America, was useful for keeping livestock safe, but was also called as Devil's Rope by Native Americans for curtailing movement and misappropriating lands. It was used in the Boaz and continues to be this dual symbol of death and torture, as well as protection. It keeps the chickens in and the wolves out. And it does link directly to the first section of chapter 1, which is, if we could go to the next slide, the road to Koche. Now, Koche is considered to be the largest of the United Nations prisoner of war camps, which held the North Koreans and the Chinese prisoners captured by the UN forces during the Korean War. By 1952, about 170,000 prisoners were crammed into this space with only barbed wire separating them, with each compound. So this, allowed, for the free exchange of thoughts and ideas and the opportunities to plan and execute mass demonstrations and riots. And here we now pick up the story, or Curator P does, of where she thinks perhaps Mr. H is captured. Then we go to the next section and we scroll right. And though the first section suggested that he was sort of picked up in fields, here we see many different ways he could have been captured: on land, on the water, on the streets. And this is part of our methodology that Curator P undercuts herself. All these are archival images. All these photographs are records of instances that happened in the Korean War. And so this sort of suggests that we are telling you a historical story, but also a fictional story. We're providing you with a multiplicity of views, and the photographs are our raw material. It is the material of our story, and it is key to allowing the story to unfold. This is the next section, missing text. And, we allow ourselves to ask questions, to think about, the world of Mr. H. Did he have a sweetheart? What happened to her? And it is, could we have the next slides, please? And the scrolling to the right. We use these pictures to suggest a story, to build a story, and ask you to come into the story using the photographs.
Just let them finish seeing all of them. Yeah, can we go to the next section? To the next slide. So you just, if you could scroll up to the single photograph. Yeah, thank you. So we, as we sort of went through multiple accounts of prisoners, of Indian guards as well, various accounts of how these prisoners had lived and what they were facing, what they were hearing. Some of them had been captured so early on in the war that they spent practically the entire war as prisoners. And we also found ourselves encountering various points, various sort of moments of great action within the war. And we decided to weave this into Mr. H's narrative as well. So for example, in this section, The Intense Irrationality of a Dream, we discuss, how does Mr. H deal with not really knowing what's happening to everyone that he knows and loves outside there, in the actual sort of theater of war. And sort of we make a reference here to this one particular bombing that happened, which was in the port city of Wosang. Incidentally, that bombing, and it was a huge blockade that was conducted by sort of the United Nations forces, right? So the Americans, the British, the Australians, everyone that was a part of that army. It was the longest blockade. It lasted 861 days. And by the end of it, that entire section of the coast was decimated. Nothing really survived. And we began to wonder whether, if Mr. H is from that kind of area, and that was where his family was, what kind of happened? How did he deal with it? And the entire time he would have been, in sections, in sort of camps like the ones that you're seeing on your screen right now. And how did he deal with that? That's sort of the question that we wanted to answer with this section, or at least ask, if not really answer. Yeah. Can we scroll down to the next section?
No, I think there are a few more images of Wosan to be seen in that one, right at the end.
Oh. You can just move to the end.
You know, the
the
blowing
sort of
up of the sand, the
the image with the image with sort of the giant explosion is one image from sort of one of the attacks that was done on Wosang. Yeah, if we could go down now. And after sort of this long incarceration, there comes the opportunity to return to your home country if you're a prisoner. And we thought, well, what does that mean for people that decided they didn't want to go back? What motivated them? What made them decide that they didn't want to? And we came across, this sense that so many people that decided they didn't want to go back felt deeply cut off from everything that they had known. They had no idea where their family was. They had no idea what kind of lives they'd be returning to. Some of them were terrified of, sort of the governments that they were returning to and whether there would be any kind of, repercussions for being captured in the first place. And it was that all of those reasons led to soldiers and prisoners of war deciding that they would much rather take their chances somewhere else. And if you can just scroll down. Yeah. And so then at the end, when the armistice is sort of signed and most prisoners of war have been returned, you have this, this final group who don't really know, who, well, honestly, neither side knows what to do with. And so it's decided to put them in the demilitarized zone, which is this huge operation of sort of having to move them there. And those are some of the images that you're looking at over here. We also had so many pictures of prisoners being transported. And we sort of sometimes we've also taken those images and used them. And what you're looking at over here can you just go to the previous? Yeah, there's just this one. This is sort of the peace village area in the demilitarized zone, near which these camps for the prisoners were set up as well. Yeah, you can close this section and go down to the next slide.
So we have a video here, which you could play first, perhaps. And just look out for the double narratives over the course of this video.
In Chennai, Mr. H's chicken farm was on a not too large piece of land, right off the dirt road that led to the highway. All around his land were paddy fields for as far as the eye could see. The land itself was perfect, but pipes had to be installed, coops had to be built, and fences put up. Even after all that, Mr. H sometimes felt that his chicken farm would never truly be finished. There was always something that needed to be put up or fixed or added. But he was proud of his little farm. He built the chicken coops along modern lines, and they could house up to 50 chickens. Mr. H had taken particular care with his fencing. He had to keep the chickens in and the wild dogs and thieves out. As he was building it, he'd experienced vivid flashbacks from his time in Georgia and the DMZ. When this happened, Mr. H reminded himself that these fences weren't for him. He'd climbed taller and more cruel fences, and now he was free.
So, can we just stay with the previous slide? Thank you. So the videos themselves use a mixture of archival, photography and archival video material. And as we did the research, we couldn't help but see all of those interesting parallels, sort of between the life that we were imagining that Mr. H led and, the life that he sort of led after he left the DMZ and eventually came towards India, and life in the DMZ itself. Did someone come in? I'm getting a lot of pinging on my, can you hear
Yeah,
me?
someone came in.
Oh, okay, all right. That's great. And so we grew very interested in how we might sort of, play with that, and how might we create really interesting parallels and sort of bounce certain ideas off of each other. And that's where this sense of the double narrative comes with. It's something that you will see us using several times throughout the exhibition. And it just became an interesting way to really twist what the meaning of the photographs or the videos that you're looking at might be. Can we go down to the next slide?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a very key section of our artwork. When, if you notice what Nayantara said, we are looking at two different times, 1953 and 58. And we introduced several critical strands. So if you could just go down to the next screen. We've enjoyed putting this whimsical pairing of Mr. H's unlikely friends, the CFI guards at the DMZ and birds from Palikarne wetlands in Chennai. So let me explain that a little bit. The Custodian Force of India, or the CFI, took their role as neutral but humane guards and protectors very seriously. And the fact too that they were not allowed to engage in violence, coercion, or even the threat of violence against prisoners. So they had taken charge of over 25,000 prisoners of war, and they had to maintain discipline with them as well. So we liked to imagine that Mr. H eventually learned to trust them and found some form of friendship there, just as he did with the birds from the Palikarne wetlands in Chennai, where he set up chicken farming and was an immigrant in a strange land. We have used liberally from two archives here. The CFI images are from my father's personal photographs. And, once we go through them, we will pull up a picture of him standing next to Thorat's view. For the origin, yes, that's him, the shorter one, standing next to Thorat's view in the Demilitarized Zone. So the origins of Chicken Run are autobiographical. My father, General Nayar, then Major Nayar, was picked by Major General Thorat to be the assistant military advisor in the advanced mission team of about 12 civilians and military men who went to Korea to assess the situation before dispatching the custodian forces. He stayed on till the end of the CFI's time in the DMZ. And it was the starting point for Nayantara and me to work with the archives that, the writings and the pictures and the videos that my father had specifically left for me, to look into that and to start a project together. Now, the other archive here is that of Rajiv Kalmadi, and from his extensive birding pictures. And we're very grateful to him for sharing images of the Palikarne birds and taking us through the different kinds of birds that Mr. H could have seen in 1958. And birds, of course, like barbed wire, are both a literal material of the artwork, as well as a metaphor. And they talk of homes and nests and feeling safe, as well as of migrations and new places. And it is this sort of duality that we try to talk about in this place, where we show the unlikely friends that a very lonely prisoner of war and a very frightened prisoner of war would have made, and equally a very lonely and very sort of frightened immigrant who comes to a strange land, not knowing the language, and maybe finds a relationship with nature, with the birds of Palikarne Marsh. So from here, we move on to the next section. And do notice the use of wires here, barbed wires. And when you're going through the website yourself, as I hope you will, please do look at some of the pairings that we've thought. If you could just go up a bit again, for example, this wonderful Sikh gentleman who's, posing with his stick, and the lovely moorhen in blue sort of preening next to him, we thought were just, wonderful pairings. And we leave you to discover them yourself. So the next section that we go to is called Changing Seasons. And we record the passage of time in this flashpoint zone of the DMZ with the changing seasons. It is, they go through a very, very cold winter, which was horrifying for the, Indian soldiers who'd never experienced anything so freezing and cold in their lives. But the changing seasons is also a reflection of the decision-making process in Mr. H's mind. We sort of, take you through the scenery and through the life, and then we sort of, eventually, it culminates him taking a decision, jumping over the barbed wire, and asking to return to India with the CFI soldiers. There's an image there of a nest in a tree, and these are little hints and clues that we leave studded throughout the narrative, where the narrative is deeply layered. You sort of see it at one level. This is for us a very poignant picture of the birds sitting on these wires in the demilitarized zone. And it was perhaps the start of many of our explorations about birds and soldiers and migration and living. And make no mistake that the DMZ was a very dangerous place and heavily mined. To go outside the camp area was very dangerous. There's an account in Major General Gurbaksh Singh's memoirs about a soldier who stepped out to pick a plug, to pluck a twig from a tree and was blown to bits. So, they were doing, a yeoman's job of trying to make sense of the strange land that they had come to look after the prisoners and keep them safe, while allowing them chances to make up their minds whether they wanted to go home or to another country. Or as in the case of Mr. H, he was among 88 prisoners of war who decided to come back to India. To the next section in Nayantara.
Yeah. While we were looking through archives, we also found lots of very interesting images of photographers, and we couldn't help but sort of rather playfully create this. One of the things about the Korean War is that at that point it was the most heavily photographed war ever. There were hundreds, thousands of photographs, and they're all in archives, sort of in the West, archives in America, archives in the UK, some in Korea as well. And despite India's involvement and fairly critical involvement in that last section, the last sort of bit of the war, there weren't a lot of photographs. We had this wonderful personal archive left by my grandfather, Parvathi's father, and that was sort of it. We had to work really hard to find images outside of it, and we thought that it was really interesting, though, that there were all of these wonderful pictures taken by my grandfather, where he features, as a sort of he sort of leaves himself a little bit as a shadow, and that's a picture of him with his camera right there. I think this is when they're on the boat. So we just thought it would be an interesting section to put in to sort of ask questions about the process of archiving itself. Why is there such a lack of photography about this from the Indian perspective? We just wanted to put a couple of those questions in with this section.
Yeah, and I think, it was part of our whole research process that it was so difficult to get information and to get pictures.
Yeah, so much of it was luck in that sense. It was, we reached out to someone, and then maybe 3 months later we'd get a reply, or someone would put us on to, in touch with something. I think my aunt sort of, with no hope at all, reached out to a trust that then got us a couple of texts, that then got us a lot more connections. It really did kind of snowball the whole process. So that research process has been quite interesting, but also fraught. And occasionally we've sort of been like, oh God, how do we get that photograph? And sometimes we haven't gotten the photographs we've needed as well. So
yeah, I mean, there was months spent just writing to people, asking for permissions. And, I kind of remember sort of trying to track down a photograph, going to the writer of an article, to the South China Morning Post, to the editor, to the photo editor, to another magazine, then trying to trace down the descendants of the person who took the picture. But that led, it was a dead end. But we were extremely fortunate with other pictures and other permissions that we would talk about later. Yeah. So then we come to this section, which is called Compasses in Their Eyes. And, at this stage, it's February, and the CFI is coming back to India, and along with them, the 88 prisoners of war who have wanted a neutral country. Nobody would take them. They've said India would do for the moment. And these themes of migration and immigration resonate as powerfully, if not more powerfully today than in 1954. And here was this man, our Mr. H, who was leaving behind everything he knew for a place he knew nothing about. And we, the process of a journey gives us so much, the physical process of a journey. And that's how, and we have these images and we sort of use them again, sort of to give an idea of what it meant to leave this cold place, take this train journey along with, their bags and baggage, and then eventually reach the port of Incheon, which is from where the ships sailed. So through this barren and bleak DMZ and a country ravaged by war, in this train, setting out smoke signals, away they go and come to Incheon. And I love this little picture, which has sort of, my father's trunk in it. And Incheon, of course, all these sites are sites that are incredibly important historically. Incheon, for example, is famous as the historical site of the Incheon landings during the Korean War. And it was an amphibious invasion that ended on 19 September 1950, headed by General MacArthur. And that was a decisive victory in favor of the United Nations commands, which eventually led to the recapture of the South Korean capital of Seoul. And so now I will let you onto this troop ship, the Asturias, along with everybody else on February 8th, 1954, with its first contingent of 1,520 officers. Could we go to the video now? The next one. And here we go.
I can only guess what Mr. H felt about leaving the place he had lived in all his life. Anxiety? Fear? Hope? Were some of his fears allayed seeing the warm welcome given to the returning Custodian Forces of India when their ships docked at Madras? Let me read you a small article I found welcoming the CFI back to India. After nearly 6 months of exemplary service, the Custodian Forces of India have finally returned home from Korea. Stationed within the dangerous demilitarized zone of the 38th parallel, the CFI were protectors and guards to Korean prisoners of war who did not want to return to their home countries. The CFI faced many challenges, including the icy Korean winter and difficult prisoners. Their hard work and dedication have won them international acclaim. After a long journey, which included a train ride from the demilitarized zone to the port city of Incheon and then several weeks spent aboard ships, the CFI reached Madras yesterday. Mr. Rajagopalachari, Chief Minister of Madras, and his entire cabinet received them with much celebration. Mr. Rajagopalachari remarked in his speech, "These are soldiers of a great peace emissary who by their work and behavior have brought great credit to the motherland." General Thorad, leader of the CFI, said that their return to India was truly overwhelming. Along with the CFI was a small group of Chinese and Korean prisoners of war. These men, having decided not to return to their home countries nor to the other side, chose to come to India. Several have expressed an interest in immigrating to the American continents. We welcome them to India and wish them the very best.
I find it very special to think that I'm looking through my father's eyes all the way back to 1954, to a time before I was born, to see Korea and India through his lens, because the videos that we're showing, other than the first one, have all been taken by him in Korea and in Chennai. So as we saw when the Asturias drew up along the South Quay, they were met by this large crowd led by Rajaji. And there was Mr. Sri Prakasha, who was the governor of Madras, military and civil officers. And let me add to what Nayantara's voiceover says by reading you a few lines from the speech of Mr. Sri Prakasha. It's taken from Indelible Reminiscences, the memoirs of Major General Gurbaksh Singh, and Mr. Sri Prakasha says, 7 months ago, I gave you a send-off from this very harbor. I said this was the first army in the world ever to go on a mission of peace. There is no doubt that you have made a concerted effort in a very difficult situation. I hope whatever lessons you have presented to the world will not be forgotten. So could we stop at those slides, the previous ones? Yeah, those last images actually are also very special to us because we were able to contact the daughter of a prisoner of war, Mr. Liren, who went from India to South America. And these are his photographs of the time spent by the Korean prisoners of war in Delhi. So you saw them getting onto the train, and these are images from Delhi. So the next slide, please. The press cuttings and press clippings were also a very large part of our research, along with books and memoirs like that of General Timaya, General Thorat, General Gurbaksh Singh, my father's own papers and comments. And this is a lovely cutting which shows how the South, a contingent of prisoners of war going off to South America. Mr. H didn't get onto it. He came to Chennai, and there I will let you take over, Nayantara. The next section.
Yeah, so you can just go down to the next section. So this next section is called Seeking Bolt Hole, Herons Required. And this is a section where a lot of our fresh photography features. If you could just scroll down. We came across this very interesting fact when we were researching the prisoners that actually chose to, not return to their home countries, to not stay where they had been captured, but to sort of leave and go to a neutral nation. And, as Mayant already said, some of them left India and went off towards the Americas. Some of them actually eventually did return to Korea, and a few of them stayed on in India. And that's really where our inspiration for Mr. H comes from, from this one line in a text somewhere. And in that same text, they discuss, can we just actually stay on that slide? Yeah. So, and one of the things that text also discusses is that the prisoners who came to India took on various kinds of training. They decided that they wanted to try to earn a living, and one of the things that they took up was chicken farming, and that was very interesting to us because already we had these really interesting ideas about of being captured, of being kept in these barbed wire fences, and we thought that's an amazing parallel, and we wondered what that would have looked like and what that would have meant. And so we sort of wondered, well, if Mr. H did choose to stay on, did he stay on as a chicken farmer? And that's how this section of the narrative is created. Can you scroll down now? And of course, as a metaphor, it works on multiple layers. So if you just sort of look at, this is another area where, if you just scroll down a little bit more, Will, just slightly, thank you. There's where we employ that kind of like double narrative. So as we were researching chicken farming back in the 1950s and 60s, and then also modern chicken farming, we came across this interesting idea of how chicken farming had transformed from being something that was fairly simple and straightforward and quite labor intensive to this remarkably industrialized, deeply unecological process. And we just sort of, we wanted to play with that here. If you scroll, can you scroll? No, sorry, can you scroll to the side wheel in the previous one? You will sort of see that there are, again, two narratives, one about sort of Mr. H's own time there, and the second, which is about all these facts that we discovered about modern farming itself. And yeah. And can you scroll down now? Yeah. And then we also sort of we had the continued character of curator P. What was her relation to this, And this was also a section where we sort of explored how was she trying to make sense of it, and how was she tracking Mr. H down. And so this is another section that deals directly with that Palikarne link that also links the project more specifically to Chennai, to the city that both my aunt and I come from. Can you go down? And we continue to sort of use the really interesting comparisons and the metaphor of birds. This is something that we enjoyed. Some of these photographs are very much fresh. So the photos of these birds that you see here, the previous photos of someone working on a wire, all of that was taken newly in the last year in 2021, and we had to sort of arrange it. So we had photography assistants and models and some very unwilling chicken as well, who just they didn't want to be shot. We sort of had to run after them with like seeds and sort of ask them to act like chickens. They seemed quite content to just sit down and go to sleep. So that was an interesting experience. So this fresh photographies are photos that have been taken by my aunt. Can you scroll down? And it was while taking this fresh photography that we encountered, just pause here. We encountered this really interesting set of parallels between archival images we'd found and images that we took while we were just really out there recceing and doing research. And it presented us with such an interesting opportunity because so often, dramatic narratives like this, they really sort of, we were questioning what is the place of the geography of something like this. A lot of modern narratives are very often about this problem of place itself. And it seemed, that Mr. H's story, the story of, these prisoners of war who chose not to go back, not to stay, to go somewhere else entirely, that it was very apt to be, sort of pathologized almost. You could either call it's the victimage of location, I think it's Una Chaudhary that says that, or you could sort of say it's the heroism of departure. Those are the two big narrative lenses that are used. But of course, it isn't actually that simple a choice. Mr. H chose to leave, but it's out of desperation. It's a feeling that his entire world had kind of been torn. And so much of his past, we felt, must still haunt him. And we really needed a language to describe this, to make this clear to anyone who, came in and saw this exhibition. And that's sort of what we found possible with this kind of play of photography. This idea that the past is constantly being created again by us, or that the past is recreating itself in these kind of loop-like images. And it's a system that we've really used in various parts of the work. Can you just scroll down?
And so we come to, the last section of our story per se, where we tell you that Mr. H vanishes. And could we go to the first section in that, Water Losing Memory, where we come across these maps, which are, maps that I have hand-drawn based on research of how the Palikarne wetlands are shrinking. And, just to sort of give you a tiny insight into our working process, we found these maps, we wanted to use these maps, and then Nayantara said, well, maps is something that have always fascinated you. Why don't you hand draw them? And it's true, I've always been fascinated by maps. They're absolutely truthful depictions of a place, and yet they are not the place. The cartographical act of mapping, flattening geographies based on the existing knowledge of the world has always shaped our understanding of the world as well. And though abstract, maps carry tremendous charge. And in this particular case, it also fits in organically with the overall thematics of Maps of Disquiet of Chennai Photo Biennale. And it also reiterates the questions we've already raised with chicken farming, questions of sustainability. I suppose war is the most unsustainable occupation of all, but on a micro level, things like chicken farming, which were once something that was done in small farms and then became something unsustainable that polluted the land, was cruel to chickens, and the fertilizers ran into the water. So we also bring up these ideas of our connection with the land and water, and perhaps an immigrant's relationship to a city through the familiar and the unfamiliar, that is through water and nature. And then to go to the next section, we sort of, use a term from art to talk about the importance of negative spaces. So, we go back to Curator P and to the clutch of photographs she was given that was discovered in an abandoned farm that we presume was the farm of Mr. H, also part of our fictive imagination. But as we say, there is so much that you learn from absences, so much that you learn from things that are no longer there, from birds that fly away and leave behind shores and horizons. And that takes us very nicely to the last section of this Mr. H Vanishes, which is in the form of a photo poem called To Those Still Standing. Now, a photo poem is also a form that has fascinated me. And, it was a term that was invented by Nicole Bulestro in the sort of time of 1935, when it was, during the surreal time, when she used the term photo poem to talk about how Paul Eluard's poems were combined with man-raised photographs. And Bulestro writes, in the photo poem, meaning progresses in accordance with the reciprocity of writing and figures. Reading becomes interwoven through alternating restitchings of the signifier into text and image. And now, if you can just pull back from the actual pictures to the pictures and text, could we just go back to the page itself? I would like to, if I may, read out this photo poem to you, which says, trapped time travelers moaned the unbuilt hearth, the unfilled receptacles of the heart, the unlit fires, little remains, crossing and recrossing the airborne carrion slashes through habitations. In the train wreck of my mind's eye unspools childhood war games, a sentinel cause to those still standing, Chicken Run. And that is the, that is the photo poem that sort of sums up perhaps our engagement with Mr. H and Curator P, with the People's History Museum of Chennai, where this long forgotten story about the forgotten war is being sort of excavated and dug up a little bit. And we, really hope that you're going to go to the website and look through this in some detail and read it for yourself. But first, could we also just go to the next section, which is the section of acknowledgements, which is very important to us because we've worked with, some really wonderful institutions such as the Peabody Library at Harvard, the Pepperdine Collection, with my father's archives, and we thank my mother, Mrs. Satya Ramchandran, for letting us use them. We've had Mr. Liren's pictures, we've had Rajiv's pictures, and we also took this project 3 years ago to InKo Centre, and Rati and her team at InKo Centre thought about the project and found it had legs and found it was worth supporting. And we really are very grateful to InKo Centre for that. And then to Bhooma Padmanabhan, the co-curator of the Chennai Photo Biennale and Chennai Photo Biennale itself, that has worked with us through sort of prompts to take what was originally a piece, we had imagined this in the real space as a large photo sculpture, as a series of images that would be three-dimensional and move into walls and ceilings and floors with the latitude and the longitudes of the different places set out. And it's been a tremendous process taking it into the digital world, but I think we are the richer for it. And it's been an amazing process. It's been a huge collaborative process. We would like to thank Sushil and Samuel and so many people who've helped us with this. So Nayantara, I would also sort of leave you to just show us the image research guide.
Yeah, it has been a really wonderful process. So because of the wide-ranging kinds of images we've used, if you do, and I hope you do go and see the actual exhibition, do take some time to go through the image research guide, because the images come from all over. They come from various authors, and there's a detailed list of that. If you just scroll down to the end of the webpage where the exhibition is being hosted, and you'll see a document like this. It tells you who took the photo, where it was taken, when it was taken, and it also gives you a sense perhaps of our working process. How have we repurposed them? How have we used them again? So that's just for anyone that is perhaps a giant nerd about photographs and wants to know more about it. Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really lovely to walk through the project with you again. We've had so much fun putting together the photographs and writing out sort of Mr. H's story and doing all of this, and the process of doing it online has been wonderful as well. I think we worked really well with some of the limitations that were kind of thrust onto us by this entire digital process.
Do we have any questions?
We do have some questions. So Nikhil's asking, why was he called Mr. H?
Well, I'll answer it in part to say that when you use, I mean, it's a terminology we've used, curator P, Mr. H, and it sort of links back to when we do our actual limits of change process. And it sort of also stems from childhood stories my father told me about a Miss P, who was full of daring do and adventures and, rescued princesses from pirates and, good people from bad people. And I was dying to know, was Miss P me? And he would never tell. So those stories do become part of our larger project. And we just thought we would keep a few connections to that project with this. Anything you want to add, Nayantara?
No, that's you've said it perfectly and eloquently as always. We have another question, which is from Ravi, who asks how much time we've spent on this project. It's a slightly complicated question in the sense that the real origins of the project are actually December of 2017, which is a very long time back. But the specifics for sort of the Chennai Photo Biennale, probably the last year or so. But yeah, the research has been wide, and it's taken us quite a lot of time. Like I was saying, the research process was so complex and quite slow moving. So it's really taken us that many years to put it all together and to come to this point where we suddenly have this wealth of information. We started off not knowing very much about anything, actually. So
yeah, I mean, it was, we circled around. I mean, my father's papers talked about his time in Singapore, in Burma, in Korea, and there was wonderful sort of circling around to figure out what we wanted to do. And I think we also realized that there is a richness in this process of, we would find an image, we would write a line. Sometimes I would write a line, Nayantara would find an image. And it was very much a question of back and forth to create the shape of this project. And it's been, a very enriching process.
Yeah, the time that we were able to give it has sort of led to, I think, the richness of it as well. And we now find ourselves, very fond of Mr. H, which, which is kind of funny, I suppose. But yeah.
Yes. Well.
Sorry, we have one last
way forward.
Yeah, one last question. So the way forward, we have an entire project planned around this area, specifically things that are more concentrate a bit more on the CFI, the Custodian Force of India, that were in sort of the demilitarized zone. And so the original sort of the idea was that we had this wonderful visual art come performance, sort of storytelling piece that was going to be, in a location, and we're going to have audiences that moved through the space, and then, COVID happened. So we hope that that's still very much the way forward, but obviously things being as they are, we can't be certain of anything, but the work is still very much happening. So the work that will eventually lead to that is well underway. We hope you can all come and see that when it goes live and in person.
We thought it would be just small groups of people, 10 or 15 people who would be taken through it.
Yeah.
I think Lena there's one other question, which I will just ask, and maybe we should stop.
Yeah.
Since you've worked with fact and fiction as well as personal and collective memory, how did you decide to what degree in which to include all of it? And that's a really good question, because I think the one thing that we decided that we wouldn't do would be to alter history. I mean, we always worked with what was historically possible. Mr. H may be an invention, but there were prisoners of war who came and took up chicken farming and photography. So there was, and then we did want it to have the spirit, in a sense, of my father in it. And I will just sort of read out a line from my father's notes, which was called The Limit of Change, where Major General Nayantara Nayar, says this about his Korean experience. Our troops vindicated the faith the country had placed on them by displaying neutrality and humanism in abundant measure. And, we wanted to excavate these ideas of neutrality, of humanism. What does it mean to belong to a country? What does it mean to lead this country? Because India's unique role in the Korean War came from her position of neutrality. And these ideas of war and peace, sustainability and landscape, using my father's pictures in his videos, but the work is imbued by the kind of person he was rather than him as a personality, was what is important to us. Nayantara?
Yeah. I mean, just exactly that. But just to add one more idea, I think that we had all of these facts, and we knew that those facts couldn't be altered. But the question sort of became how to humanize it. And so the fictional element really it's simply our way into this world of facts, and in that same sense, offering all of you a way into that world of facts. Because reading 20 books about this is probably not something that most people are going to do. But how can we still introduce all of these very important historical facts and these events that have happened? How can we do it in a way that sort of really hooks you in? That's what we were trying to do, and I don't know how consciously we did it, but looking back, I very much know that that's what helped us decide what to put in, what to take out, what to highlight, and what to underplay. That was what led us, I think.
Yeah. A bit of an ongoing process, and I think we also wanted to. We both, Nayantara and I, we love the local, the areas we live in, and for us, this was a story that began in a sense and ended in Chennai. The ship sailed from here and came back here, but it's a project that starts in Chennai, but it has international ramifications and implications. And I think to draw that out, Lena, was also important to us to give that sense of the local as well as its larger appeal.
Yeah.
Could I just add, Parvathi and Nayantara, that
yes, of course.
We were so excited when you brought this project to us because it ties in so very well and resonates so much with our own vision, which is about examining the local characteristics, but also the global conversations that underpin the Indo-Korean exchange or intercultural dialogue, if you like. And to answer what somebody else, a question about the way forward, we're looking for things to return to normal, whatever we mean by that, but in safe surrounds for Parvathi and Nayantara to travel to Korea, because I think there's quite a lot waiting there, both in terms of the war memorials and the war museums, but also people. And there is, interestingly, unfortunately, we lost the one person who had come to India, I think in February last year. Very, very old, but his son and family have been traced, and we hope that we will be able to find out from them whether there was any, pictures, letters, exchanges. There are other people as well, including people at the Indian Embassy who've come forward to say that they will assist, at least to set up some meetings. So fingers crossed that happens, and that sort of completes and adds another dimension to this very fascinating project as it unfolds. And if all goes well, that we have the installation and the walkthrough and the physical event happening sometime soon. I'm not going to put any date to it. Somebody had a question, I think. Right?
No, I think that someone's left their mic on.
Okay.
I think there was just one question in between which said, talked again about the whole process and how long it took to culminate and what we have today. But sort of in a sense, yes, I think about 3.5 years. Sort of some months of intense work. And it's perhaps worth saying that, we started with the CFI, and I think our larger project will have a lot of the CFI, but it was very interesting for us, right, Nainu, to kind of develop this angle of the prisoner of war while we were in lockdown. We literally, this is not sort of making it up, we were organically moved towards, looking at what the prisoners would have thought and how they reacted in the lockdown. And I think that kind of gave us a special kind of resonance to talking about, I mean, it's completely different, of course, but the notion of, to being interred and what that meant. And we've, we created stories that are part of a podcast We invented stories
Yeah.
based on historical research, that, Nayantara and I have done a podcast on it that you could listen to. There's, a short video that we've done this. And so we hope the richness of this interaction will go on for a while. And yes, as Rati says, at some stage culminate in the actual physical exhibition.
Yeah. So someone had asked whether there's a bibliography on the website. There isn't, but we're actually quite happy to share that. Anyone that wants to know more about this, just reach out to us, and we are more than happy to share interesting reading material. So, yeah. Okay, I think that was the last question.
I think so. I mean,
yeah.
No formal vote of thanks, but really thank you all so much for coming here. We do this so that we can share it. And it's just been an incredible experience to work on this with Nayantara, who's, brings in amazing skills as a writer, as, who sort of sees a certain vision. And I think while it's been a fantastic process of agreeing and disagreeing, and I think that's what's resulted in this. So, the collaborative process has been fantastic, and it's been wonderful to share it with you. Thank you so much, really.
Thank you, everyone. We hope you get a chance to see the project.
Please do. Please go online. The Chennai Photo Biennale has been extended till the end of February. So, there are still opportunities to go and sort of browse through it. And, if you know where we are, so please sort of send us any feedback or comments or suggestions that you have. This has been, also a labor of love for me. It is hugely personal, I will not deny it. And I think autobiography gives it that charge. I look on this as a way of finding out about my father, whom I sort of knew as, like I would say to some people, as a gardener, as a general, as a father, as, many things, but never as a soldier. And this was, for me, uncovering that. And I think for Nayantara, it was also a process of finding out about a grandfather she's never met.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. And
thank you.
Please do have a look at the website, as our Parvathi and Nayantara mentioned. And we look forward to your support and hope to see you soon. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you all so much.